Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Liz Miller. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing here at the Chief Marketing Officer Council, and I am thrilled to be bringing you one conversation that I got to tell you is probably one of the hottest conversations around today, and it is around productivity. It's profitability through positive productivity. We're going to be talking about best practices and how to boost that bottom line, empower the front line, and how do we all get that done in the easiest, most frictionless way possible. So, bottom line, how do we get to that dollar faster, which I think is what all of us on this line are going to be thinking about today. So, with that, let's talk about sales. We look at sales and we need them to do everything. We need it to be done that much faster, that much bigger. We need that pipeline to be moving that much faster. But in a study that the CMO Council did, we found that 46% of executives felt that to actually maximize sales across the organization, we need to find ways to action on opportunities that had to be, those actions had to be boosted, they had to go faster, speed to action had to be accelerated, and speed to close had to be accelerated. Here's a challenge. We were looking at sales and saying, go faster, but not necessarily providing the tools to actually get them there. And the reality is that according to CSO Insights, only 33% of a sales representative's time is actually spent actively selling. So in a world where the organization is looking to sales and say, hey, move faster, and sales is saying, okay, but we only have about 33% of our time to actively do what it is that you want us to do, something has to change and something has to be different. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We've got an amazing panel of experts today, and I got to tell you, there is not a whole lot of times where I know that I'm going to be taking notes furiously through this conversation because we've got two amazing thinkers. I'm joined by Greg Swinder from Oracle and Frank Caspetti from Harvard Business School, who is also an incredible author. Guys, I'm actually going to turn this presentation over to you. Greg, love to start with you just to get us a sense of where we are today and what are we doing.
Great. Thanks, Liz. So little brief note about myself. As Liz said, I work for Oracle, and I've been working in this kind of sales effectiveness area for a long, long time. That's both in a marketing capacity, supporting a global product marketing team, and also directly supervising sales teams. And the audience that I've always been dealing with and the customer base I've always been dealing with is sales organizations of companies. So again, I've been in that space for a long, long time. And as I look back on that experience and I talk to all of the customers and the sales prospects through the sales teams I've managed, there's a lot of common themes that we see across those organizations. The first one is that just about all of them have made some pretty serious investments in CRM technology over the years. What's amazing about that study, and many companies, especially larger ones who have been around a long time, have done it in multiple ways. In order, they've been on sort of their third replacement cycles in CRM. But if you really dive into that CRM investment and you ask the chief sales officers if they got out of that investment what they did, most of them will tell you no. Is that we've done a lot kind of to improve our sales org, and we get a little better data. Maybe our forecasting is better, but ultimately my reps are not more productive as a result of the investments I made in CRM. And if you dive into why that is, sort of the first biggest kind of glaring point that comes out is user adoption, is that the tools never quite get deployed with the adoption rate and have the uptick with the sales team that they really want. And interesting observation from one of the analysts who was at our conference, the Modern Sales Experience in Vegas last week, is her observation was, you know what, every CRM investment that doesn't get adopted has a negative ROI. So that sort of encapsulated that right there. So it's like, hey, you got to get reps to adopt the technology that you put in front of them. And also, every CRM investment, they haven't quite automated as much in the sales process and in integrations with other systems and processes that are going on at the rate that they wanted when they started the journey. And as well, the reps themselves are spending a lot of time because of that little bit of a gap in automation. They're spending too much time on back-end administrative tasks, and that has not changed over the years. That it was true 10 years ago as it was 5 years ago, and it's true now. And so, again, those are just three of the reasons. You see others here, is that pricing mistakes and pricing errors are still happening, and reps are still discounting too much, right? And so you combine all those factors, and those are the things that really drive productivity. So, well, why is that, right? If best-in-class companies at selling, right, why is that they're still not getting the investments and they're not getting the results on a CRM investment that they thought? Again, take a layer deeper to that is that there's still a fundamental gap, and that gap is both a process gap and it's a technology gap. It's not just one or the other. And that's a gap between their overall sales technologies and the sales systems they're using. Obviously, CRM sort of sits at the heart of that. And then also the back office systems that are ultimately running the P&L of the company and running the fulfillment engine of the company, and that's their ERP system. And so there's still this gap in between those two, and sales reps get squeezed right in the middle of that gap. And well, why does that gap exist? Well, there's no CRM system out there, and even some bolt-ons to CRM systems that really allow a rep to find the right products and guide them to the right solution, products or services that they want to sell when they're in front of a customer, right? There's nothing that gives them guidance on exactly the right price point to hit and the right discounting policies to face. They're not presenting the right sales materials to the client at the right time, whether it's proposals, whether it's contracts, whatever it is. And then ultimately, when I need to take all that stuff and as a rep, what do I care about? I want to book the deal, right? I want to get paid. There's nothing that is letting me very easily and very quickly book that deal and make sure that's seamless without me stepping in or a back office team stepping in and doing a lot of massaging of what was on that quote or what was in that deal or that opportunity and taking that and now getting it into my ERP system, right? And so that's where reps are still spending too much time. So we think best-in-class companies are helping to fix that gap, right? And they're helping to bridge those two areas. That's their front-end CRM system and their back-end ERP system. And what can you do if you can really solve that? Again, with a lot of process work and a lot of streamlining to eliminate non-value-added activities, and as well, obviously, to invest in the right technology that's going to help fix that gap. So what can they do, right? Companies that fix this gap, and here's a stat from Aberdeen, is that companies that fix that gap with the right investment in technologies will close deals 27% faster, right? And that's because all of that back-end order processing, delay, administrative time, right, is ultimately preventing you from getting the right stuff to your customer and ultimately booking a deal in that time, and that's costing you time on your deals. As well, reps, a lot more mobile capabilities nowadays, right? If you get the right tools to them, they can drive additional sales-facing customer time, right? Get me out of the back office, get me off of my email, and get me in front of a customer, even with, maybe an iPad in front of them, and I can close more deals. Obviously, that's what we want reps doing is spending more time in front of customers. And as well, if I get the right price discipline instilled in my team with the right tools at the right time, so that I'm not confused over what my price should be, I'm not confused over what my pricing policies should be, right? And I can enforce that at the time that they're putting quotes and putting deals together, you can make more money. You will simply make more money because you'll be setting a higher price point on your deals, and a higher price point on a deal that you're going to win is going to go straight to your bottom line. So that's sort of what's at stake to companies who can truly become best in class. And with that, I'll turn it over to Frank.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, for that introduction. I appreciate it a great deal. It is my pleasure to be here. My background is reasonably straightforward. I was your standard issue professor at Harvard for about 11 years, making my way up the hierarchy. Then I stumbled into a business, left academia, ran the business for 12 years, and just got plain lucky. Sold the business at exactly the right time. So what you should see in front of you is my title slide, Linking Strategy, Marketing, and Sales. Perhaps my major message to those of you watching this webcast is I highly recommend luck as a strategy. It is great. It's treated me well. Now, around this topic, this is obviously a very big topic of trying to link these core elements of a business. I'm not going to cover all of that in the next 20 minutes or so, But what I am going to cover in my attempt to make this as useful as possible for those of you from various companies watching this webinar is the following. First, I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you to help set the context for the issues I want to discuss. Then I'll try to say a little bit about the problem and some of the causes of the problem that those numbers illustrate. And then obviously the bulk of my comments will be about what I call the so what, now what. What do we do about this? And I'm going to suggest 3 areas that as marketers, salespeople, strategists in a firm, you may want to focus on. Now, let me begin with some of the data. According to the best data I can find, globally, firms spend about $100 billion annually on consulting, training, activities associated with strategy, either, formulating strategy or changing strategy. But here's the number I want you to focus on for this session. This is about U.S. companies. U.S. companies spend annually, every year, about $900 billion on sales forces. Now, just to put that number in context, and by 900 billion, what I'm talking about there is, what we pay salespeople, sales compensation, travel and entertainment, etc. That figure is more than 3 times what companies in the United States spend on all of their media advertising. It's more than 20 times what they spend on all digital media, and it's more than 50 times what they currently spend on social media. On average, it's about 10% of revenues, and clearly it's more than 10% in many B2B businesses. Now, when I see numbers like that, I'm reminded of a comment attributed to Mark Twain. If you put a lot of eggs in one basket, keep your eyes on that basket. And if we keep our eyes on this basket, what we see is that many companies, in fact, have a big problem. Linking strategy and sales is by far the biggest part of strategy implementation for most companies. That's what the numbers on the previous slide say. But listen to this. There's a company in Europe called Effectory. Effectory is basically the European version of the Gallup organization. And every year they do a survey, and it's a terrific survey. They get about 300,000 plus responses annually. They send it out to employees at different levels, variety of industries, companies around the world. And one of the questions they ask in their survey annually is, do you understand your company's strategy? Fair question. Here's the results. Less than 50% of employees responding to those surveys say they do, meaning more than 50% say, sorry, I really don't have a clue. But here's what I consider the really alarming part of what the Effectory data show. The closer you get to the customer, in other words, if you begin to look at the responses from sales and service employees, customer contact people, the percentage of employees who say that they understand their firm's strategy goes down. It doesn't go up. And obviously, it's very difficult to execute something you don't understand. Another study, Maricon. This is a company that takes return on invested capital seriously, as shareholders do. What Maricon's research indicates is that on average, firms deliver only about 50 to 60% of the financial performance that their strategies and sales forecasts promise. Now, if you want to understand why my students, my MBA students who go into investment banking and private equity tend to be a somewhat cynical lot, you see it there in that second bullet point. Investors are constantly dealing with executives who overpromise and underdeliver. That is what the data says. Surveyed by Booz & Company last year, almost 3 out of 5 of the C-level executives in that survey said their biggest challenges is allocating resources in ways that support the firm's strategy. And I think this supports what Greg was saying at the outset of this session. A good article that despite the investments in CRM and so-called big data investments, about 7 out of 10 leads from marketing are ignored by sales. That's the negative ROI he was talking about. And then finally, a McKinsey study. What companies have done in the past decade, and if you understand the impact of the Great Recession, I think some of this becomes intuitive. Companies have actually done a pretty good job decreasing their production, operations, back office costs. And the McKinsey study indicates that in the last 10 years, the average S&P 500 company has decreased its cost of goods sold by almost 300 basis points. Now, if you add that up, that's a very big deal. That's a couple of $1 trillion. But SG&A has increased as a percentage of firms' costs. It hasn't decreased. And you can see what's going on. It's a shifting focus of productivity from where it has traditionally been the last few decades, back office operations. Increasingly, it's about sales, the SG&A, because that's where the money is, and that's getting more attention from CFO and other finance groups. Now, what causes this problem that you see embedded in this data? As with most important things in business, there's no one cause. Very few big issues in business have, one big cause. One problem is that many companies do not have a strategy. They may have initiatives, they may have visions, they may have purpose statements. All of those things are important, but they're not the same as a strategy. And the bottom line is it really is difficult to get good things done on a sustained basis in business without a coherent strategy that responds to market realities today, not yesterday. Another reason for this disconnect is the typical planning process in corporations. Research indicates that planning process now in a typical Fortune 500 company takes anywhere from 4 to 5 months, almost half the year. Now, while that's going on, obviously the market is doing what the market will do. And what that means is even if the output of that planning process is a great strategy, which is clearly a big if, salespeople still have to respond account by account, issue by issue in buying time, not planning time. So very often the output is irrelevant to sales realities. The data about how many people don't really understand their company strategy, lack of communication is a big issue. Now, if you ask executives, why don't you do a better job with this? The most common response you hear by far is, well, we don't want our competitors to know our strategy. To which I always say, you've got much bigger problems than competitors knowing your strategy if your own people don't understand it. So I frankly believe that's more than a bit of a bogus response. Changes in the composition of the C-suite. This is one of the unheralded major changes in American industry over the last 2.5 decades. In the last 25 years, the average number of executives reporting to the CEO has doubled. But if you look at where are these people coming from, who are they? Most of them, the vast majority of that increase is not general managers, line of business heads responsible for integrating strategy, marketing, sales, operations. It's mainly specialists, CMOs, for example, CIOs, CFOs. 30 years ago in the S&P 500, there were twice as many COOs as there were CFOs. Today, the proportions have almost exactly flipped. So arguably, you could say that the C-suite in many companies is more siloed now. Now, why has that happened? Because business is more complex. We are living through a data revolution. It does take more to be a good CMO, CSO, CFO today than it did 25 years ago. It is a more complex, more analytical job, but the reality is at the end of the day, it has to be brought together to execute. Sales metrics and compensation plans. 70% of comp plans incentivize salespeople simply based on sales volume, irrespective of the profitability of that sale, the cost to serve that customer, gross margin, etc. The message in a plan like that is that any sale is a good sale, but that's not what a strategy is about. If a company has a strategy, it's not true that any sale is a good sale. And then the last issue I would cite is a misunderstanding about the impact of the Internet on buying and selling. And let me again give you a little more data about this. There's a big myth out there that somehow salespeople are being, quote, disintermediated or replaced by e-commerce or the Internet. That is simply not true. And it's not true even that there's a reduction in the number of salespeople. Here's some data that tends to surprise people. In 1999, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were about 12.9 million workers in what was reported as sales occupations in the United States. 15 years later, in 2014, the last year for which we have full BLS statistics, there's been an increase in the number of salespeople, not a decrease. And that increase is almost certainly vastly underestimated. Why? Because in an increasingly service economy, many people that do business development for a living are not salespeople for reporting purposes. They're called partners or managing directors or vice presidents, but they're sales. According to Burning Glass, a labor firm, sales jobs are among the hardest to fill. And according to a good competitiveness study here at Harvard Business School, they're among the top 3 in career lifetime value. Again, the Internet is over 20 years old, but e-commerce in total, all of it, still accounts for less than 10% of retail sales. But the Internet does impact buying behavior. It does not replace salespeople. That's the myth. But it does change sales tasks. Obviously, buyers now have product, price, all sorts of information available to them in their pre-sale search, and that affects important tasks, hiring, the necessity for multi-channel approaches, and required interactions between marketing, sales, and service. All right, though that's sort of the nature of the problem, etc., what's required to do this better? Let me focus briefly on 3 things and then wrap up and hopefully leave time for questions. The first thing that I think is important for people, not only in sales, but in marketing and strategy, is to understand the impact of sales decisions on core drivers of finance and enterprise valuation. And by enterprise valuation, I mean if you're a publicly held company, your stock price. If you're a privately held company, what investors value you at. The other issue that's important here is to understand that effective selling is ultimately an organizational outcome, not only the result of good salespeople. And then the third issue is to manage what I call the strategy to sales performance cycle. A couple of things about each. What is the goal in any business? The goal in any business is ultimately profitable growth. And what that means, because at the end of the day, you don't have much of a business without paying customers. That means what we're out to do is optimize the revenues we get from exchanges with each customer minus the costs of customer acquisition and customer retention. And what that means is that ultimately there are 4 ways that any company can increase the value of the enterprise. What I've got on this slide is essentially what you learn in finance courses. One is you always want to try to invest in projects that earn more than their cost of capital. Secondly, You want to reduce assets in any activities that earn less than the cost of capital. Third, you want to get the most. You want to increase profits from your existing capital investments. And then fourth, whenever possible, you'd like to reduce the firm's cost of capital itself. Now, in my experience, and my experience with companies around the world at this point in my career is pretty good, most CEOs and CFOs understand what I just went through on this slide. The reason is if they don't understand it, the first time they get beat up by the analysts, they learn in a hurry. What many of them do not understand, however, is what's on this next slide. And that is how seemingly tactical sales decisions affect each one of the drivers of enterprise value. Invest in projects that earn more than the firm's cost of capital. Step back, ask yourself, why do firms invest? The vast majority of capital expenditures in most firms are driven by revenue-seeking activities with customers. We want to make money with customers. What that means is that the customers we focus on, customer selection criteria, are terribly important because ultimately they're driving investments. The question is how many people in the C-suite really understand the compensation, deployment, performance management issues that drive call patterns and customer selection in sales. Increase profits from existing capital investments. Think about what happens in most companies when a sale is made. What happens, and this is part of what Greg's unit at Oracle helps companies do, what that sale does is it largely determines asset utilization patterns in most firms. So you want to stay on top of that. Reduce assets in activities that earn less than the firm's cost of capital. This requires ongoing information from and understanding of what field and frontline activities are doing. It's a two-way street. That's why CRM systems that aren't used are indeed a negative return on investment. And then finally, you want to reduce the firm's cost of capital itself. Now, this may sound like something completely irrelevant to sales. You know, the way I like to phrase this somewhat sardonically is, let's call up the investment bankers for their advice because haven't they demonstrated, he said sarcastically, how smart they've been in managing their leverage. But get back to basics. The single biggest driver, the financing needs in most firms are driven by the cash on hand and the working capital that you need to conduct the business. And the single biggest driver of cash out and cash in is, in fact, the selling cycle. What sold, how fast, and at what price. And that's why some of the issues in sales are not just sales issues. Whether executives understand this or not, they're also strategy issues, and linking those two things is vital. Next issue is sales productivity. Here's the way I think about sales productivity. Let me just explain this framework for you. But I see sales productivity as a function of three things. First, the sales force's capacity. And by capacity, I don't just mean feet on the street. How many calls can we make? But also the salesperson's capacity or capability. What is it they're capable of once they get in front of a customer? The second item is close rate. Capacity says, how often do we call? Where do we call? Close rate says, do we close a sale? And the third issue is profit per sale, right? What kind of sale is it that we close? Now, if you think about it this way, you can deconstruct sales productivity into some managerially useful levers. How do you increase sales capacity? Either by getting people to work harder and or smarter. Now, I want to spend a little time on the first part because, again, I find this is often misunderstood. Working harder in sales counts. It really counts. What the data shows us is there's a very high correlation between number of calls and sales outputs. And what that means is if you can free up more time for selling through better quoting, better order accuracy, better pricing, you in fact will probably increase sales productivity. But so does working smarter, understanding, for example, how the internet is changing buying behavior and focusing your available resources, selling resources, but also marketing and service resources on those areas that are high impact, where they make a difference. You increase close rate through better customer and opportunity selection. That's ultimately a strategy as well as a sales issue, and through better account management, and in many businesses, better third-party channel management. And then you increase profit per sale 3 ways. The base count, better pricing, continuous product innovation. You increase it by cost management, which also counts, lowering selling costs and process efficiencies. But then the third area is by management, because management counts, managing the performance cycle from strategy to sales. And I'm going to wrap up with this slide. One of the ways to think about linking the topics for our webinar today is the following. The key issue in sales is to understand what are the sales tasks in your business. Not the sales tasks in another business, not the sales tasks in some generic sales methodology, but what are the sales tasks in your business? And those tasks are going to be determined by 2 things. One is, if the company has a strategy, that strategy is presumably making choices about where we play and where we don't play, those market choices, and those choices in turn affect the customers we call on, the buying processes that we're going to encounter, the buyers we need to develop relationships with, etc. All of that affects sales tasks. Then the issue is, how do we get our actual selling behaviors to align with those tasks? And ultimately, there are 3 levers, so to speak, available to managers. The first and most important, as always, is people. Who do we hire? What do we do with them once we hire them? How do we train? How do we develop them? In my experience, still huge amounts of improvement available in most sales organizations when it comes to these basics of hiring and development. The second issue is the control systems. How do we organize sales? What are the metrics we put in place? Compensation and incentives, a necessary but not sufficient cause of affecting behavior. And then the third issue is what I call the Salesforce environment. Who do we hire as sales managers, not just salespeople? Performance reviews. In my experience with sales forces around the world for decades, I would cite performance reviews as still the most underutilized lever for affecting behavior in organizations, and especially sales organizations. Busy sales managers tend to treat them as, cursory, drive-by conversations that are really about compensation, not about review, evaluation, and development, and that's a mistake. And this is a trainable skill. There are things you can do to get people to be better at performance reviews. And then there is the culture of the company, the cross-functional communication that does or doesn't exist between sales and other areas of the firm. If you want to learn and do more about this topic, and Liz, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all of this is available on the share site for this webinar. There is a good book by a professor at Harvard called Cespedes, Aligning Strategy and Sales. I hope everybody will go to Amazon, buy that book, read it, and if you do, I make you a very, very sincere offer. I'm dead serious about this. If you read that book, send me an email. Frank, here's what made sense to me. Here's where I disagree, and here's why. I have found over the years, this is not my only book, but over the years I have found that's the only way to improve. I also have posted there with the links a couple of articles One is about, I think, the increasingly important relationship between sales and finance. Another is, I sort of covered some of this earlier, but selling to customers who do their homework online. And then the most important issue I started with earlier, an article about hiring. I'm going to thank you all before we end for your time you've invested in this webinar, and wish you all the best, not only in your marketplace, but in your careers as well. But on that note, Liz, why don't I turn things over to you and see if we have any questions that Greg or I might address.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Frank. That was absolutely fantastic. We do have several questions that have come in. And just as a quick note, let me do a quick housekeeping. For folks who are now racing to Amazon to madly find Frank's book, like you guys should, we've actually gone ahead and put a link to it right in the attachment viewer if you were watching this live. So you're going to be able to go right in and get to those articles and get to that book. So it's something that I certainly recommend you guys do. But we do have a couple questions, so I want to be able to jump on those and be able to get those. One is another housekeeping question, though, which is about this webcast. This webcast is going to be available on demand, so you're going to be able to go and click through slide by slide using the viewer that you're actually using today, so that's certainly not a problem. One question, and Frank, as a moderator, I take, this is kind of my fee for moderating. I get to ask the first greedy question, but anyone else who's out there, please feel free. Keep submitting those questions. We're going to get to them. But one of the things that you mentioned is the kind of the siloed effect that the C-suite is now really experiencing. And I think you bring up a really good point with as we've made our organizations far more complex, as the technology stack has gotten more complex, it does seem that the C-suite does begin to not only become more siloed, but perhaps drift farther away from each other. Those gaps and those visions kind of keep growing. And we hear a lot about the alignment between, say, the CMO and the CIO, but we haven't heard as much about the alignment between that CMO and that CSO, that Chief Sales Officer. Why do you think that's fallen out of grace a little bit? Is it because the technology is shifting hands, the dollars are shifting hands, or are we spending too much time in the C-suite maybe pointing fingers at one another?
I'm going to give you a response that to some extent is all of the above, but let me make observations. One is it's important to understand why this change in the C-suite has occurred. And it's not, think about this, step back. Very, very few organizations, in my experience, say, I got a great idea, let's get more siloed. Very few executives want that to happen. There are market realities out there. We are living through an industrial revolution. What it means to be the amount of data available to a CMO and the people that report to the CMO today is vastly different than when I started teaching marketing at Harvard Business School, 20 plus years ago. Similarly, the very, very useful sales productivity tools that Oracle sells also make sales much more of a analytical issue. So there are reasons why these specialists are there. But one of the costs of that is being siloed. Now, what drives the other thing I want to point out is this is not a new issue, the marketing sales alignment issue in particular. I did research about this 15 years ago. There's another good book you can get on Amazon, probably for 10 cents at this point. But if you look at that book, you're going to see quotes going back to the early 20th century, marketing pointing their finger at sales, sales pointing their finger at marketing. So there's something embedded in the relationship. They are two different jobs. Yeah. Marketers get paid to think in terms of aggregates, in terms of segments. Salespeople, if they're doing their job, get paid to know everything there is to know about those particular accounts. Both things are important, but you can see the tension that's built in. What do you do about this? One is, and here I always liken this relationship to what I call the middle school dance. I don't know if my metaphor is communicating, but you go to a middle school dance, 7th, 8th grade, all the boys are on one side, all the girls are on the other. Now in a couple of years you're going to be horrified by what you see, at the high school dance, but someone has to take the initiative in that relationship, and in my opinion, it's marketing, not sales. In my opinion, many marketers do need to learn more about what's in my slide that I call the seller's compass. They do need to learn more about what the sales tasks are today, not yesterday. I also think, in my opinion, that many marketers do need to disabuse themselves of this notion that the data simply does not support that all business is becoming online business. There are many marketers who believe that, and that's just not true. So, sales tasks are changing. And then the other thing is, this is an issue that is bigger than sales or marketing. And again, it sounds like a cliche, but it's a reason it's a cliche. Leadership counts, and it does start at the top. Make sure the data is there. Make sure it's good data. When I sit on boards, that's part of my role as someone who's supposed to know something about sales and marketing. Make sure we're talking about real stuff and not platitudes when it comes to this core activity in the business, which is how do we acquire and retain customers. That's a leadership issue.
Yeah, I love it. That's terrific. And Greg, it leads into a question for you. I've got one housekeeping question, though, for you, Greg, that I'm going to ask you, and then my real question. So the first question is, what does CPQ stand for? So could you share a little bit about that? So one very enterprising person has written in and saying, CPQ, what does it stand for? So, Greg, I'd love to give you a chance to share about that. But then also, in certainly something that both you and Frank touched on, as we're bringing these new tools and platforms in, what are you really seeing? I know that you work with some of the biggest and probably some of the most complex sales organizations out there. When they really start to kind of break down those tasks, understand, as Frank put it, how those tasks are linking into that strategy and how it's linking into extracting the maximum value from that strategy. What are you seeing as some of the kind of key differentiators, some of those key must-haves when we really start to look at how we're making this whole team more productive?
Yeah, great. Well, I'll take the short one first, and thanks to the analyst community out there for the wonderful acronym, CPQ. But what CPQ stands for is configure, price, and quote. So the part of the Oracle business that I represent and the products that I am responsible for is now called Oracle CPQ Cloud. And in a shout out to Prince, that is the quoting solution formerly known as Big Machines. So some of you may have heard that acronym or that name in a past life. But that's what CPQ stands for, and it's a sales quoting tool, and it stands for configuration, which is what are the right products and solutions to match my customers' requirements at the time that I need to find them as a sales rep. So that is the configuration. Pricing is exactly what it says, which is how do I price this solution in the right way in order to close the deal. And then quote is how do I generate whatever paperwork it is I need to close the deal, which is Q, which is quoting and proposals. So. To the second question is, what are the must-haves for any company as they look to do this? And I'll sort of preface this way: is my answer is really about what are the companies that do this right? What are they thinking about? And the companies, in order to deploy these solutions and integrate them in the right way, number one, they take a very holistic look at their entire sales process, not just a very focused look at any one of those individual pieces. And so again, it's not just about just picking the right products, because if I want that, well, gee, I'm only taking a look at part of the selling process. It's also about picking the right products, matching them to needs, forming the solution, pricing it correctly, working with finance to make sure I've optimized my deal value, and then ultimately making sure I generate the right paperwork. And I'm covering all of those touch points across the org, which is a very process-driven, holistic view of my selling process, not just a technology view on do I have the right technology to fit kind of any one of those things. And you need to look at that in the context of all of the other orgs that really touch or are impacted by that selling process, because sales does not operate, although many people would think they operate in a vacuum, they really don't, right? They really do operate right in the nexus of a lot of other orgs who are obviously very interested in growing the top line revenue and ultimately booking deals. So I'll sort of leave it at that.
That's great. That's great. Frank, I want to direct this question to you, and then Greg, I'd love to get your feedback after. Frank, the questions come in. Should sales be more of a group dynamic across various disciplines that informs strategy, evolves strategy, and monitors the progress of said strategy?
I'm not sure I understand the group dynamic metaphor, but to the extent I understand the question correctly, I think my answer is no. Strategy precedes sales. Now, what I'm about to say, you're free to disagree with the person who asked that question, but let me tell you, from the point of view of a board member and investor, this is not a Socratic question. There is an answer to this question, to this statement. There is no such thing as effective selling if it's not connected to the company's strategy and business goals. This is part of the reason I think Greg is 200% correct. This is why you need that holistic cross-functional view of sales, both pre-sale as well as post-sale, to implement these systems correctly. Now, it may be good for that salesperson's compensation, but it's not good for the company if we do a profitless sale or we do a sale that's not on strategy. And strategy is something that you don't just do in sales or marketing or finance. It is something you do at the relevant business unit level. So no, I don't think the issue is turning sales into, frankly, what I would call second-rate strategists. I think the issue is making sure that our sales execution is the execution of our strategy, not some other company's strategy.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that, ultimately sales are executors of the strategy that has had input from lots of different places, right? And obviously what's going on in the competitive marketplace and what sales is seeing is the key kind of input to that. But I would agree with that is that, right, sales, ultimately what the rest of those organizations need to do, and especially in the C-suite, is to steer sales onto the opportunities to close the deals that, number one, they have the chance to make the biggest impact on the business, right? And two, are the ones and the customers and deals that they want to have, right? And that often is that there's a product strategy to that. What products and services do we want to use to differentiate, right, in any given selling situation? And what parts of the market do we need sales to go attack? And so that input at the strategy level, obviously sales has an input to, but I would say sales is not the definer of that strategy. But once that strategy is coalesced and agreed upon and everyone is aligned, sales needs to align with that strategy if they're going to move the business in the way that they thought they were going to move. So,
yeah, terrific.
If I could just add to that very briefly, and Greg, comment on this. You may see it differently. But one of the things I see happening, and this is really especially the case in a lot of tech firms, but it's spreading, but the introduction, the jargon varies, sales operations groups, whatever, but they are the folks that are now increasingly responsible for making exactly the links that Greg and I are talking about. And what I find interesting when I speak with these people, most of them don't have a sales background. They have a finance background or a so-called big data background. And we may be encountering here another dialogue of the deaf. They know the metrics that count. They may or may not understand sales. Well, sales doesn't know the metrics, but they know sales. This, it doesn't help us to just move the silo down a level, but this is the way companies now, I think, are trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and Frank, I would probably just add on that, that sales operations function, again, they do tend to come from all, kind of different backgrounds and that kind of thing, but what we have seen is an elevation of that function within orgs. Is that was a function which was very much a support role for a long, long time. And we do see that position getting elevated in many companies to the point of the actual titles of them, right? They're in meetings and into reporting relationships that they were not 5 and 10 years ago. I think that's just an interesting trend in that position, especially as the communicators of that to sales and as these sort of operational folks who are going to help sales execute and align on that strategy. is being elevated within orgs.
No, I agree, and I think one implication, I think, is for both sales and marketing people. The days of responding to those questions with anecdotes, I think, are dated. It is getting more data-driven. It is, and if you don't have the data, you're on a limb.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that kind of leads into a question that's come in here that I think you both will enjoy answering, because I think it's an interesting one, and I will add a little to it. But the question is that with data governance expertise growing, and I would argue with big data, whatever you want to call it, big data, little data, dark data, there all the different tags we now have for data that's across the organization, be it sales, marketing, data that's flooding in from our ERP systems and directly from our customers. With that expertise growing and how to manage and extract insight from that and then be able to turn that insight into action, the question is it possible that someday the CIO will be replaced by an AI? Gentlemen, I'm just going to go ahead and let you attack that one. Greg, you want to jump on that one first?
Well, I don't think, at the end of the day, I don't think anything is truly going to be replaced by AI. Yeah. Maybe not, in my lifetime, of course, that could, or by the end of my lifetime, maybe I'd be wrong. But the point about data is that, and again, a little bit to the previous comment, is that the person who's going to take this data and do something with it and put some analysis behind it and know, again, how to build that data into the intelligence of the salesperson is increasingly vital. Because one is, as Frank had said, the inspection on sales productivity has never been higher. And while in a world where often doesn't operate with as much data as it probably should or historically hasn't, the opportunity is enormous to use data to back, again, the efforts of a good sort of relationship seller and to back them with data and to steer them in a direction that aligns with some actual data analysis. But the upside there is just tremendous. So the folks who can do that and who have those skills and can pull all the data that's out there and help steer the selling person into the right space, there's huge upside to that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that, and I'll give you two factoids that I think that might be useful in thinking about this question. I'm with Greg. I don't think the CIO is replaced by an algorithm. I think he or she is replaced by another human being, and that's exactly what's been going on. I mean,
Yeah.
You've seen the data about how in many companies the CMO now spends more on IT than the CIO does. So that's the shift. The second is, and this is a little factoid that I think may sort of put some additional punch to what Greg said. Very good study. It happened to be, again, by McKinsey about 4 years ago. Now, I got to believe if this was true 4 years ago, it's even more true today. McKinsey looked at firms around the world with at least 1,000 employees. And what they found is that each one of these firms, each one, 4 years ago, already had more data in its CRM system than in the entire United States Library of Congress. So the issue is not just piling up more files. The issue is what Greg said earlier. Do we have a process? What is always true in technology is garbage in, garbage out. I mean, that is a fundamental truth, and that's a management issue. That is not a technology issue. So I don't think people are going to get replaced, but they have to figure out what data counts and what doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a follow-up comment that got sent in by our audience that their comment was that, it's potentially that Skynet is going to replace the CIO and the President of the United States. So I got a good chuckle out of that, so I did want to read that off to you guys. Listen, we're going to close with this one question, and I'd love for the both of you to tackle this, but Greg, I'm going to start with you. I know that you would, when we start looking at our investments and trying to look at where we extract the ROI from those technology investments and and the kind of the frustration that I think that a lot of the organization, not just sales, but I know that as a marketer, I have the frustration of looking at those CRM systems and thinking, okay, do I need to replace it? Is it not the right one? Is it delivering on the promise? How am I extracting the most ROI from it? So the questions come in is, how do you analyze the ROI of a CPQ solution to see if it's the correct fit for any given customer? What do you recommend? And I know that puts you in a hard spot because you're with that portion of the Oracle organization, but as people are looking at how do I calculate that ROI, what do I have to start looking at? What are some of the things that you would recommend? Here's where we really need to start looking and how you start to look at that ROI equation.
Yep. There are many different ways to do it, and again, in the interest of sort of a tighter, just give me the top three where I would like to focus. I'll probably focus in on three. There's three metrics ultimately that I think you can start to measure in your current business, hopefully if you do have some set of tools or at least a rigorous enough process that you can measure it, and that you can impact in a great deal by a CPQ deployment. And so the first one I would say is your close rate, right, is analyze the effectiveness of your reps or your channels, if you sell through a channel business, however it is, your ability to close competitive deals and look at that close rate. And again, it doesn't take much of a lift in that number to justify a pretty sizable investment, right? Because that's incremental net new revenue and more wins. The second is overall productivity, and I would start with sales productivity. And what I mean by that, look at the time spent by your reps to close deals, and especially on the administrative tasks that they spend time on in their sort of weekly cycle. That's kind of the second one. The last one I would put is basically what is the cost of incorrect orders. And that can manifest itself in a number of ways, but that's like, hey, we got an order in, customer, it was not quite right for whatever reason. It was a data entry error. We had the thing packaged wrong. The sales rep didn't spec it correctly, right? Number of reasons for that. And ultimately, we had to fix that for a customer. That tends to be a very hard material cost. And again, most companies will measure that, and that comes back in the rate of returns. That comes in the rate of sort of expedited freight if you're a hard product company, or it's kind of a customer sat metric of customers leaving us, right, and sort of turning down in orders and going elsewhere. So those are three I would start with.
Excellent, excellent. And Frank, I'm gonna have you close out with this question, and it's a hot topic, and I think you actually already touched on it a little bit there. But the question is, there have been comments that the CMO's longevity is less than 2 years. How do you improve this short executive role? But I'm gonna shift the question just a little bit because I think that the tenure of the CMO certainly has been long touted to be quite brief. But you look at some studies from headhunter firms, and they're anywhere from 2 years, 2.5 years. Certainly the tenure is growing. We're also seeing other tenures like the CIO, certainly like the chief security officer, kind of all these different silos in the C-suite. Their tenures are certainly getting shorter. So when we start to look at that C-suite tenure, and I would say across all of those titles, certainly marketing, sales included, what do you see out in the future as the must-haves to make sure that the longevity of that role is actually getting longer and not shorter, or does it need to get longer? Is a shorter tenure A-okay? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think about these issues, from the point of view of investors. And from the point of view of investors, we do live in a capitalist society, although let's hold our breath about who the next president is. From the point of view of investors, the issue is not longevity. The issue is who is it that's there long short. And CMOs, I think, are a good example. First, you've got to take the data with a bit of a grain of salt. A number of companies establish chief marketing officers to help them get their act together about marketing. Help us with this. Put in the basic plumbing. What is it that we need to do to get serious about brand beyond platitudes, etc. And part of the reason you see CMO longevity as what it is those people actually do their job. And then they move on. They move on to some other role in the company or somewhere else. Now, let's talk about what I'll call the bad outcomes, all right? I think ultimately, and this is the marketing version of the question that I think Greg answered so ably, at the end of the day, you got to show results. At the end of the day, business is a performance art. It's about outcomes. And in the marketing area, that's always been an issue. Right? You know, everyone knows the jokes that stay jokes for a century because they have so much truth. 50% of my ad budget's wasted. I don't know what 50%. Social media, and that joke has exactly the same currency. Now, the issue, I think, is that marketers do need to get more precise about where they spend money and where they don't, and this is not a precise science. Marketing is not a science. It is an art, but it's an art that increasingly has a lot of empirical data available to it, and that's why that dialogue between marketing and finance, for example, is so important. So it's a two-part response to your excellent question, Liz. Longevity by itself is not the end game. Profitable growth is.
Right.
But if you want to keep your job and get promoted, it is going to be about showing how we influence outcomes, and not all of that influence in marketing is quantifiable. It's not. But we've got to make sure that we understand what is and isn't.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, I think Frankie hit it right on the head there. We did a study a couple of years back where we asked CEOs and executive board members why they brought on a CMO, and 56% said that it was to fix a broken marketing machine. So there's certainly that perception that, hey, something's broken, we're going to bring in someone in the C-suite to fix it. And I think that's true of any C-suite organization, not just marketing. So to both of you, fantastic, really great information, and thank you both so much for joining me for this past hour. We are getting to the top of the hour, so I do want to let folks go on, especially if there's sales folks on the line. They're probably itching to go back and, you know, be that performance-driven machine right now. So we're going to let them go. On behalf of the CMO Council, on behalf of our partners over at Oracle, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Remember, there are some attachments in there. The team has been great and provided 2 downloads that you're going to be able to get to actually be able to see the CPQ, must-have or luxury item, and modern quote to cash, maximizing your CRM investment, along with 3 great links to Frank's wisdom that you can go ahead and grab online. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us today. And guys, until the next time.
Thank you.